things are changing very quickly. There's an awful lot of disruption going on in the industry. And when I first heard the term disruption tossed around, I was thinking, well, people aren't getting it. They're saying disruption, and it's like it's a bad thing, like it's going to rock the boat. And then I actually remember coming out of some meeting talking about strategy and disruption. I quickly Wikipedia disruption and disruptive technologies, and sort of got a sense that this is actually an opportunity, and if you don't hop on it, you're really going to be left behind. So I think the key to a lot of this is really embracing and understanding the disruption that's going on.
So basically, and I think you did a great job introducing this. What we're talking about here is that broadcasters are looking for a platform that can deliver all the different kind of media, from linear to VOD to over the top, everything, and not have different workflows, different problems to do that. So that's really the new reality. We can't live in the silos, as you mentioned before. And it's good that we're all speaking the same tongue here, I guess. So this is your slide, so.
Yeah. Well, user expectations, we'll get into that a little bit. I think, obviously, as Dave kind of mentioned, the audience is changing, the demographic is changing, the expectations of an audience now is very different, and the audience 5-10 years from now is very different than it was in the 90s when the cable industry was really booming, and we better be ready for that, or they'll just turn us off and they'll do something else. I think in the technology area, Peter put the second point together, and I actually just added in IP there, because I think broadcast facilities are needing to change more to IP-based, and as Dave had mentioned, that a NOC or a broadcast NOC becomes more of a traditional data center. I think moving video signals around, baseband video from point to point through a NOC, that's gonna end at some point, and I see it all going, IP multicast within these facilities, where you've got richer metadata opportunities, certainly, shifting things from MPEG-2 to MPEG-4 technologies, with much improved compression. I come from the digital side, and I look at all this MPEG-2 stuff we're doing everywhere, and I'm amazed. I'm like, we could be 4 or 5 times more efficient with the compression. Why aren't we doing this? It's just because the broadcast gear is so ingrained in MPEG-2, you really can't get out of it so easily. So, but that's all going to have to change. And then I'll speak to this one. On the user expectations thing. I think one of the hardest things the industry is coming to grips with is this anywhere or everywhere kind of concept. We say TV everywhere, and in some cases it really is everywhere, but there's an awful lot of these restrictions for in-home or differentiations of in-home, out-of-home. And a lot of that differentiation is, based in the deals that we make, Viacom makes with companies like DirecTV. But it's awful hard for, I think, consumers to get their head around that. They use the word Byzantine there, how do you, when somebody says, wait a second, I can get this in my home, but when I walk out the door or walk 10 feet away, or it doesn't work, or I can get the content if I'm on a Wi-Fi connection, but I'm not allowed to get the content if I'm on a cell connection. These things are going to be harder and harder to rationalize, and I think we're going to have to move past them. And I think also, as Dave had mentioned, this cord never generation that's coming of age, or is already of age, they're going to want to pay less money to get just what they want. And so I think there's an unbundling trend that's going to happen. I think there's a disaggregation trend that's going to happen, pulling the programs away from the network. People say, I want my Jersey Shore, but I don't care if it's MTV or whatever. And that's a real hard thing for us to get our heads around, because we really don't want those franchises to be disaggregated. And that's going to be a challenge, is to keep the value of them together, but still allow people to get what they want. I'll take this one too. On the consumption experience, just for a while there was a big trend towards download, and I think that is changing. I see more and more stuff going towards streaming, because you're more likely to be connected in more places all the time. I think the airplane is a really good example of that. Who would have thought years ago that you'd be sitting on an airplane streaming video? You figured you'd have to preload your device, download everything you want, and sit there. And I think that's important for delivery technologies, because streaming is a very different kind of way of looking at things than download. It's important from a rights and DRM perspective, because the kind of protections one needs for streaming are different than what you need for download. Download really requires the full boat traditional DRM stack, tracking licenses, issuing licenses. Streaming, if you're always connected, you actually have some simpler things there in the DRM space. And then in the consumption experience, just a couple quick points here. I think right now you're seeing a lot of, it's still the same linear programming that always was from the 1950s, pretty much. It's the same style of storytelling, putting a program out there, story arcs, the episodic way of doing things. And we're augmenting that with second screen, new technologies where the audience, on their iPad, if they're watching, there's all sorts of extended experiences, voting, character bios, whatever. And there's some technology challenges we face right now to keep the second screen in sync. So I think there's a whole world of stuff evolving there about how the second screen knows what's going on the first screen. But I think where things will go eventually will be that the storytelling paradigms will start to change. And I could imagine a future where the linear, the story that goes out on linear maybe is adjusted based on the Twitter sentiment that's going on. If certain people are tweeting during the show that they are more interested in one character than another, that could certainly send a signal to the NOC to put up a different final segment. Maybe they've baked 3 or 4 final segments that feature different characters. They could subtly change how they present the story based on the audience, and I think you're going to start to see these kind of things evolving, and obviously there'll be a lot of technology challenges around that.
So what do all these changes mean? And I think the first thing is that the volume of work that content providers are doing these days to provide for second screens is ramping up exponentially. And so what was at first, several years ago, just a little side thing you had to do, or when we have customers who are today are just doing nothing but capturing their linear channel and turning it into a VOD, is now having to create content for all these different platforms, all these different versions. And even within that, they're doing multiple versions because they're tailoring it for when they're going to air on different platforms and different things. So the workload is huge. But I think the also thing to remember is that the revenue stream from these delivery systems is a fraction of what they're probably getting from their broadcast linear channels today. So that's a key thing, is we have to create huge efficiencies here.
Those of us on the digital side remember that all the time. Everything we're doing is for like 3% of the bottom line or something. We're constantly reminded of that, but we know it's going to change.
So again, it's this platform. We know it exactly. We know it's going to change. We know that the revenue is going to be there, but the volume is going to keep increasing. So now it's become just as important as the linear platform, if not more important. And an example of that, this is a place down the street here called HBO. Sorry, it's somebody else, but here is their existing linear facility with 30 channels of playout, 65,000 square feet. And here's the new building that they're building that is for VOD, for second screen. And it's roughly, almost the same size. It probably is actually larger when you realize that the main building has administrative and, and then the restaurant and everything else or whatever else. So effectively, they're putting as much space into delivering for nonlinear as they are for traditional. And actually, probably even a lot more when you think about how much more efficient the equipment is today for nonlinear than all the linear channels playout systems they have today.
So what have they got in there? What's in that other building?
So anybody here from HBO? Okay, then we can talk about them.
But I don't have a building like that.
Right. But I think that, one of the messages I think we both want to get across is that really this may be a sign of something that's wrong rather than something that's right, because you want to use the same workflows, you want to use the same technologies, you need to have those efficiencies in creating your second screen delivery systems, because if you don't, it'll kill you. And this implies that there's an entirely different workflow for one than the other. And that raises as many questions as it illustrates. Again, part of the challenge is for every hour of on-air linear content you create, you might be doing dozens or more versions for nonlinear. So you have to have a different kind of workflow. Actually, you need to improve both workflows, but you really have to address efficiencies in your workflows to be able to do that.
Yeah, that's a good lead for the efficient reuse of media. If you don't do things efficiently, not to say HBO is doing things badly with that big separate building, but I think there are ways to really converge the workflows and really have the split as late as possible. We'll talk about the internet closed captioning thing in a little bit, but as every media company is going through, I think you're aware, come the end of September, the FCC's regulated that programming shown on television with captions, when it's shown on the internet, it also has to carry the captions. And so as we started preparing for that, we coupled that with things we knew we needed to do anyway to become more efficient and converge our workflows. And what we found is in many places, coming right out of show production, the fork was happening right there. A tape or a digital file or a hard drive would go to the linear side of the house, it would go to the digital side of the house, and then each would go down their separate paths. And of course, closed captioning was only on the linear side of the house, because why would you need it on the other side? And so now what we've had to do is pull those things together, get the captioning done before the split. And in fact, we've pulled things together so the split happens later. So that's a sort of a good example of keeping these things together and having some efficiency. The rapid turnaround time, we may have paid a little price there for some of that, because the digital folks would help themselves to an early preview version from production and start working with it right away to get up on the website, so the moment the program's over, they have everything up on the site. Now we're forced to make some of these workflows that were geared up for linear to be a little speedier. Rights is a very interesting issue in this world. I used the word Byzantine before for how users get their head around these distribution models. Well, a lot of the rights world is pretty Byzantine as well, and not at all prepared for the multi-platform world. You know, what do you do with something that's cleared for linear but not digital, but then you're streaming the channel over an iPad? You know, what's that mean? You know, or we've got a lot of cases, particularly on MTV and VH1, where TV shows have premium A-list kind of artists on the background audio track for television. They didn't clear the rights for digital, so it's, you know, pump audio, you know, or other music for we call an all media or a rescore version. And again, as you look at convergent delivery, all that goes out the window. And so we're trying to come to grips with that. And, you know, we've been talking to the business for quite a while about this, and they've, I think, rightfully realized, you know what, maybe there's not so much value in having this differentiation. Let's try to do one version everywhere and clear all rights. And I think advertising is going to be the same thing, getting rights cleared. And then Nielsen is another big requirement for success here, or whatever the measurement currency is, which, you know, these days is Nielsen. As we look at the Nielsen technologies and how they've moved into the extended screen realm, there are some particular challenges there, particularly with their iPad solution, and how they've basically taken the tagging out of the audio signal and moved it into a data stream. But having that data stream survive the delivery pipe is quite a challenge, because at every point in the pipe there's opportunities to drop this data.
So, and just speaking to some of those things, does everybody here know what C3 means? Does anybody not know what C3 is?
I think you should tell.
Okay, it's good. So C3 is Nielsen. When you air a regular show on linear television, they give you up to 3 days after that airing, where they'll give you credit for someone who watches it on VOD. But it has to be exactly the same commercials, exactly the same program as it aired, hence the C3. It's the same commercials within 3 days of airing. That creates huge problems because, you know, and I had a long meeting with Nielsen last week about this, that they want you to take the same linear show that you aired and capture it and turn around for VOD. Well, if you're MTV or the other customers I'm working with, you don't really want a linear show that has the same promos in it and the same lower third branding that says coming up next is this, because coming up next in a VOD world is meaningless, right? So first off, we want to re-author the entire content for VOD, and there are a problem there. The other issue is graphics and branding. You know, you mentioned franchise, you mentioned brand identity. These are key things. When you look at, like, if I go on my Comcast and I scroll through all this stuff I can watch on VOD, they're just shows. There's no brand identity. There's no knowledge that that's an MTV or a Viacom show or anybody else's, and I go to watch it. If they don't create some brand identity within that show, and also put in branding and graphics that create audience retention, drive viewers to watching more VOD or even drive back to a linear channel, it's a wasted opportunity, and they're losing brand identity. So I think, you know, each one of these bullet points looks like a simple thing, but behind it is a huge amount of complexity and a huge amount of work to make these things work. And I just, you know.
Yeah, the C3 thing has really dropped a bomb on everybody's VOD workflows. It's completely different, because now it means the starting point for VOD is your linear signal. Whereas we would have normally branched way earlier and made a VOD asset from the same archival assets that we would have made linear from. Now you really have to effectively record your own linear signal and post-process it. And that's just, it's been a tremendous change to deal with.
Why didn't they do that?
Well, that's because their technology isn't keeping up and they're still working. There's some changes coming up next year from Nielsen on how they're doing this. They're actually suddenly being a little more flexible. The meeting I had with them last week opened up some flexibility that wasn't there a week before. So they're starting to get it. They didn't even think about branding until I met with them last week. It was amazing how they didn't get that. But if you're spending all this money on VOD, you got to get something back for it, and at least get some audience retention and some viewers back to your linear channel. So that's one of the things that they weren't understanding. The other problem was that you cannot, for example, right now, you guys put in Nielsen with a watermarking box that's downstream of your master control. Well, that's too late because I've got all the branding and stuff. You say, so okay, I'll create another master control that does my VOD, and I'll put another Nielsen box in there. They won't let you put the same codes in with two devices. So that created a whole other round of issues.
Yeah, every distinct measurement platform needs a different Nielsen code, and it's completely at odds with the way we would think of measurement in the digital world, which is typically what people would say beacons or tagging. The player, as it's figuring things out, fires off tags, and that's just a much more flexible way of doing things. But it's just so anti how Nielsen had always done things, and they're growing.
And then of course there are all those other audience metric systems as well. So they're not the only one out there.
Yeah, I think with this change, we talked about changing, from baseband to IP. There's a whole bunch of metadata challenges that go with those technologies, and with just the general idea of having the linear signal be a starting point. Once your linear signal is a starting point for either you or others downstream to create VOD assets, or to do interesting new hybrid DVR VOD sort of features, you have to have rich metadata in there. So I think we're going to start to see changes in how people use SETE35. Right now its main function is just the digital cue point or the local avail. I think we're going to start to see much more fully marked up linear signals where you've got metadata in there saying, content descriptors, just segment descriptors, just declaring every program segment, every in and out of ad pod, every in and out of national spot, local avail, of course, with the security requirements to go around that, because now you could be enabling the whole next generation of ad blockers and ad skippers and things like this, so that needs to be addressed. But ultimately, we are going to need to get richer metadata in there to enable enhanced experiences, to enable embargoes or blackouts as this stuff goes over the internet, to enable content substitution over the internet. Nielsen, we talked about the metadata challenges there. As Nielsen does start to move the watermark from the frequency domain to a digital domain, we have to make sure that that passes through. Oh, so digital ad insertion, DAI, which had traditionally been really just about local avails for the most part. When we talk about taking a linear channel over the top, DAI may mean a lot more things. It might mean dealing with national spots that weren't cleared for a digital platform and replacing them with something, that kind of thing. And then, as I mentioned, metadata challenges. The FCC regulations for closed captioning have been a particular challenge. I've been working on this for a couple of years now. When really this has to do with issues, fragmentation in the space of over-the-top platforms, which we'll get to a little bit in the next slide. But when you talk about internet video players and flash technology or Silverlight technology or Apple's technology for the iPad, it's all different. There's different points of view about how closed captioning should be handled. Just the same way in the TV space, there's probably a dozen different ways closed captioning can be embedded in a video signal, whether it's in line 21, in the VANC, and some extra PID, or wherever it is. In the digital world, it can be also embedded in the H.264 signal. It can be off to the side in some other data file of a million different formats. So we're kind of in a format wars situation right now with closed captioning on the internet. Although SMPTE has weighed in with a standard, some companies are embracing it, some aren't. So it's a challenge right now just to get broadcast closed captioning playing through properly over the internet.
And to that note, more than just a technology, it's also a workflow issue. Let's take one of your, you guys do on MTV, do a lot of live shows. Let's say a word show. So the captions have to be inserted live, which means they're inserted downstream, typically a master control, because somebody is listening to this and actually typing the captions and they're coming back. So now the captions are probably 6 or 7 seconds behind the programming, which is ugly, but they're also not clean captions. There's a lot of misspellings, there's a lot of, might be profanity you might want to clean out. So the next thing you know, if you're capturing that live for VOD, you've got bad captions. What you really would like to do is go back and re-author those captions and get them right. But that means generating another version of that VOD content to replace that original one within the same C3 window. It also means that you have to go out there and be able to recreate that file and send it back out again, which Nielsen doesn't like. So it creates all these huge problems, that we don't even have answers for, I think, today to fix some of them.
And then for us, the meter is running on every repitch,
Right.
so you have challenges there as well.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
this one is.
Yeah, so this is sort of really the heart of where I come from in the Viacom business, is the over-the-top video delivery side of the house. But these worlds are merging together. So in the over-the-top space, it continues to evolve rapidly. Just when we all started converging a few years ago on H.264, before that, Flash Video, Microsoft or Smooth Streaming or Windows Media, whatever you want to call it, Apple, each one was different. And when people spoke about a different video delivery platform, they spoke about a different codec. So people would say, oh, you're going to an Apple environment, you're going to make a QuickTime Move video, or a Flash Video was a thing, or a Windows Media file. Now you can make an H.264 video, and it goes across all those places. So that was really good. But then, because all these guys still need to differentiate themselves and make it as hard as possible for media companies, each of them has their own delivery pipe and their own delivery protocol. So you still got Windows Media streaming or Flash streaming, RTMP, their technologies. Apple came out with HLS, which is the acronym HTTP Live Streaming for their thing. That stuff, and of course then all of them with different DRMs. That's now converging, I think. Everybody's aiming towards these chunked delivery formats. If you guys are familiar with this stuff much or not, but basically the idea that the most efficient way to do video over the internet is in relatively small chunks that represent anywhere from 2 to 10 seconds of video, and each chunk is moved atomically over good old-fashioned HTTP. Therefore, it can traverse firewalls and deal with all the HTTP efficiency that's been built out over the internet. And that in that chunked methodology, each chunk is an opportunity for the video player, to measure how well things are going based on your connection quality and move you up or down a quality level. So that's what everybody's doing now, pretty much. But each of these chunk delivery formats had, until recently, been very closely associated with a platform. The HLS one, you'd use that on Apple. HDS, that's Adobe's acronym for HTTP Dynamic Streaming, that's their chunk technology, that was Flash. That's starting to change now, and the Olympics is a really good example of that. So NBC's been using the Google YouTube infrastructure for video, and it's actually the HLS video technology. This is the first big example of the streaming technology developed by Apple for Apple being used within Flash. It's a pretty big deal, and I think it's an acknowledgement on Adobe's part that they can't control the environment anymore, and they're sort of taking a pass to some degree on the server side of this stuff and focusing on the client. I think all this stuff should coalesce around MPEG-Dash eventually, which is a ISO and MPEG based standards effort that's trying to get all of this into one environment so that we don't have to go through making 40 or 50 or 60 different renditions of every video. So that's a lead-in for this next point. At Viacom, we're trying to do it all in 8 quality levels right now. So we have an H.264 stack that goes from 200 kilobit to 3.5 megabit, 720p is our top end. And with that stack, we're able to reach virtually every mobile device all the way up to connected TVs. There's a longer tail of older feature phones, Blackberries, things like this, where we have to do a little bit different process. But for the most part, we're trying to go down this direction. And we're doing it by relying on partially on some smart CDN features. So we have the CDNs, Akamai, Limelight, Level 3. They do some transformation out on the edge. They do the HLS packaging and encryption out on the edge, so that we don't have to double, triple, quadruple our library size, which others are doing. And that's honestly probably one of the drivers for HBO's big building there, is they're cranking out all these different things. So, there's no right answer for anyone, but we're trying to go towards make fewer different variations, and out on the edge adapt it for the particular device. And then I'll just say one other point in that when we start bringing linear channels over the top, we talked about advertising replacement and substitution is going to be a big deal.
So finally, I'd like to do a shameless plug here, and it's not for the company I work for, fortunately. It is actually for SMPTE. We've only talked 15 minutes just putting context around this, maybe another 15 minutes for questions or 10. But that's nowhere near enough to really give any depth to what this conversation is. SMPTE's putting together a series of regional all-day seminars on authoring and creating content for VOD. So I invite any of you who really want to learn this in depth to consider attending one of those conferences. And I know, like Jay, some of your colleagues are presenting those as well. And so thank you.
Guess we're ready to open up for questions. Anybody in the audience?
Hot button issues?
Well, I'll start it off then. One of the buzzwords for this year is the cloud, and I wanted to know how you guys see how the cloud fits into the equation. And I know, having worked with Showtime here, that they're very concerned about their content and not letting that content get out of their hands, and to the point where they did their own VOD distribution system here rather than using somebody like TVN. And so my real question is, how willing is the content provider like Viacom to take their content and let a third-party person put it in the cloud?
Well, I'm writing a paper on that right now for the timing is pretty good. Look, well, in fact, we are using Avail TVN for some of our VOD stuff. When we talk about the over-the-top delivery, inevitably you need downstream partners to help you move the stuff. Virtually all of us, with the exception of like YouTube, who doesn't really have proprietary content, are using CDNs. So, I view there is some overlap, I think, between what services the CDNs offer and traditional cloud-based services. But I don't believe that using cloud-based services compromises security. I really don't believe that in any significant way, and I think that can be mitigated against. I think there are legitimate concerns if you go in too deep, that you may have some quality of service issues and you may lose control and you may need to swap things around. I think Netflix is a good example there. They went in very, very deep with the Amazon as what I would call the origin service. In a web architecture, you've got the edge services, the CDN, which is typically dealing with your caching and your massive scalability, and then you've got your origin, which either has actually your source video files, or it's got the business logic, business tier that's generating dynamic web pages, managing transactions. Netflix was pretty aggressive there, running the origin out on Amazon. I think if you're going to do that, you have to have a plan B. We don't do that. We run our own origin services exclusively, and then we rely on the CDNs for that caching tier. But I think to answer your question, I think moving forward as cloud services become more robust and there's more failover kind of options, I think moving origin services out to the cloud does make a lot of sense. And we're going to start looking at doing some of it.
I mean, if you think about it, we push our content out to the distributors there, the MSOs. So yes, we have the right to go audit them and say, can you delete my content? That needs to be refreshed. But in reality, my guess is there's a lot of content hanging around the MSOs.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the thing with these origin services, it's about the content, but it's also about this business logic presentation tier, and which can take some pretty serious infrastructure when you're managing transactions, social TV, user interaction, and data collection too. It's huge.
Jay?
Two questions. We have a new MPEG format that's going to arise next year. Is that figuring into your plans?
This is the new H.264 or the new
265.
H.265?
Right.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding of that 265 is with its larger macro block structure, it's generally oriented towards much bigger video, probably 4K video. I suppose it does have applicability to 1080p, but I've heard everybody really talk about it as for Ultra HD. We definitely want to have a look at it, and I know there was some recent discussion going on about whether that H.265 technology should be applicable to interlaced video. And people pushing the standard were like, this is it, this is where we draw the line, it's a progressive scan world from here on out, and a bunch of us in the media space were like, no, interlaced video is here to stay, unfortunately. And so, I think, as long as we're, in the 1080i world, I think H.265 could really be valuable for us. I think when we talk about over-the-top delivery, it's not going to be worth much until you see the decode hardware, the H.264 decode hardware out there all over the place, and everybody's PC and everybody's tablet, and then I think it will be a big deal.
Second question is, Comac, are you involved in
I've been involved in some of the little tornadoes that have spun off of it for the internet side, and we've done some work in our internet video space to do some basic normalization so that the loudness, perceived loudness of the ads is not so terribly different than the perceived loudness of the content. But that's really just to get out a little bit ahead of it. On the linear side, Mike has been all over it. And he can give you an earful.
On the linear side, we were one of the first companies to actually readjust our audio. In fact, it was probably close to 4 years ago. We made adjustments to our audio, not so much for callback issues, but for local insertion. There are a number of issues where local insertion was either too loud or not loud enough. Our content would mate with it. So we figured out a way to try and work with cable operators to do that. We kind of somehow luckily picked -24 as our standard, which turned out to be the recommended practice in the committee, which again worked out great for us. But we were very fortunate. We got in early, and as far as the linear content goes, we've been doing it for a long time.
Yeah.
take off my Harris hat, put on my ATSC vice chair hat. We just, not even published yet, but the dial norm settings for mobile have been changed off of -24. There's an RP that'll be coming out, and it's -11.
Interesting, yeah.
I think that's more where we are in the digital side. And I know a lot of the work we did was to normalize our content and advertising audio against the system sounds on your computer. The various alerts and beeps, like you've got email, those kind of beeps, and so that they didn't sound, people turn up the volume to hear the content, and then their email system beeps and it blows them out of their chair. We tried to normalize that.
Lou Zaccarella, speaking for the Society of Satellite Professionals. We've got a few of our members and our new president here in the room. I have to ask the question, as you guys, Glenn and Peter, look at all of this and realize that you're actually sitting inside a company whose tagline used to be "a little satellite goes a long way."
Did Mike write that?
That was Globecomm's tagline for several years. How do you look at the satellite industry as a partner, as a collaborator, as all of this now evolves and distribution becomes much more complex, much more challenging, fiber becomes far more ubiquitous, yet satellite is still obviously a tool. What would you guys recommend to the satellite community as you move forward?
Yeah, I think enabling us to move IP signals over satellite is certainly one of the biggest things. I mean, to the extent that we can use these over-the-top formats and everything that we're being driven to do to deliver to these platforms, if we can push those IP signals out over the satellite, cost effectively, I think that's.
Yeah, remember, with IP, essentially it's about 6% less efficient over satellite than typical MPEG is today. There are companies like NovelSat and others that have come up with some really great techniques to reduce that dramatically. So when you look at that 6% increase, add NovelSat, it kind of all goes away. So you're still 46% or 44% more efficient. IP seems to be the way that we should be going. And frankly, our company's been trying to encourage manufacturers and companies like NovelSat to push that agenda. Because at the end of the day, for connectivity, practicality, IP works a lot better than our typical broadcast infrastructure list.
Mike, I also probably want to add new tech in there as well. You guys, I see Slaughter chomping on the bit when you say no. But new tech as well, right?
NovelSat's done a much better job marketing than you guys have to say.
It's not about who makes the most noise, it's who delivers.
Look good, we'll buy the one that delivers the best.
Peter, anything you want to add to that?
I would think still that satellite's the same thing, where as a point-to-point delivery method, it's not the most effective, except when you're trying to originate from hostile areas, difficult areas to get connectivity. it's still primarily a point-to-multipoint delivery mechanism. So it's harder to see how it fits into a VOD delivery system because also VOD doesn't have the kind of real-time constraints that maybe satellite can help address.
But linear over the top.
Yeah, but that's usually, I mean, that's in a backhaul environment still a lot of times. And I mean, but I think that may change. You know, I also see that, you know, we have mobile DTV, but, you know, nothing stops us from having, you know, direct TV and other things to the car, you know, doing video over the top too, and other ways of using satellite to deliver to consumers. You know, so we might see something on that horizon as well.
Tom, does Ka-band change any of that proposition?
You'd have to have, Mr. Yablonsky is the expert on that, but certainly people are looking at Ka-band for broadband applications, so it could change.
I mean, years ago, I worked with a company called Pan Am Set on a project called Net36, which was a content delivery network that was using satellites to deliver VOD content to the edge and bypass the internet because the internet was considered an untrusted mechanism for delivering high bandwidth quality. I think a lot of things have moved forward to help address that, and there were other issues with that business model at the time. You know, but you might see something like that again.
Nick, you got a question?
We've had forward error correction delivery methods over satellite for a long time, and now the market for streaming content is starting to develop some forward error correction applications. Where do you see that going? Do you see that expanding? Because you had mentioned earlier that the most efficient way to deliver streaming content was in 2 to 10 second chunks.
Yeah.
Is that better than forward error correction methodologies?
You know, I think the most efficient way now, I think, is HTTP chunks. You know, there's a school of thought out there that, you know, once everybody gets their head around that and that all standardizes, then it's all going to move to UDP. And we'll be right back in a full circle to where we were in the 90s. When you talk to anybody about streaming, they would have said, sure, UDP. And I think we're going to go to probably UDP with forward error correction. What's interesting is when you talk to people about MPEG-dash and the H in dash is over, you know, HTTP, which I assumed implied TCP, people say, oh no, MPEG-dash could work just beautifully over a UDP network with forward error correction. I've also heard people say that one of the reasons why the UDP-based technologies work very well now is because not many people are doing it. If everybody, if all that Olympics video that's moving over HTTP were to go UDP, then suddenly we would see the chaos that happens without most people on a managed delivery like TCP. So I think that's going to be the problem, is what happens if everybody does it, and is the internet built to handle it?
Well, that's it. You know, we've had the bandwidth constraints, you know, for a number of years, so finding efficient ways to deliver that content, especially streaming content, hasn't been easy. I mean, just over the last few years with companies like AT&T, Verizon, with direct links into the house, it's, you know, put a little bit more of a competitive pressure on MSOs, the cable television MSOs, so now that they've taken their shared infrastructure down to node size where they had, you know, an average of 500 customers sharing the same data, you're down to somewhere around 250 or less. So, you know, these new techniques, you know, you're going to be more efficient, but at the end of the day, you've got to have the bandwidth infrastructure to support it.
And you may see UDP and forward error correction coupled with peer assisted technologies as well, what they call P4P, where you're getting a blend of, you know, chunks of data from the CDN, from the origin, and from anyone else on your local network, and blended with UDP. That may happen. That is happening. Some people are doing that.
I think we've reached our time limit, so I'd like to thank Glenn and Peter for the great job they've done here.